Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to part two of this three-part session on the future of the Arctic Council. My name is Eric Paglia. I'm the host of the Polar Geopolitics podcast. One of the arrangers of this three-part session, along with the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Arctic Frontiers Conference. And in this session, we'll go much deeper into the upcoming Danish chairmanship of the Arctic Council starting in May. The name of this sub-session is called Handing Over the Reins, Denmark's Chairship of the Arctic Council. And for this, I'm joined by Christian Prip, Senior Research Fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, and Dr. Gosia Smieszek-Rice, speaking Swedish there, Research Fellow at the UIT Arctic University of Norway. So thank you both for joining us here for this session. And before we go more into the upcoming Danish chair, perhaps we can start, Gosia, with talking a bit about the current Norwegian chair, which is in its final few months now. And perhaps you can reflect a bit upon some of the successes it's had and how it's dealt with this crisis the Norwegian government found itself in as it took over the Arctic Council chair 2 years ago after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So tell us a bit about the Norwegian chair and where the Arctic Council stands as of right now.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you very much for the invitation. These are really exciting times to be speaking about these issues. And I think if we are speaking about the Norwegian Chairship of the Arctic Council, and you're asking kind of about the journey of the last 2 years, I would personally say that Norwegian Chairship of the Council, I think if we'll be looking back historically at this, has been nothing less but remarkable in terms of where it started and where we are today. And I think it is still fresh in everyone's memory. But even the sheer fact that we had successful transition from the Russian chairmanship to Norwegian one at the time, I mean, it was only 2 years ago, that was really not a small feat, and a huge amount of effort and negotiations went into having this transition. I mean, it was in a ministerial meeting. I don't know if today we officially call those non-ministerial meetings, but nonetheless, the reins were passed. And Norway, which I think was so thoughtful, so meaningful. One of the very first moves of the Norwegian chairship was that they called already, I think it was in June of 2023, called for the meeting with all the working groups and expert groups of the Arctic Council. And pretty much one of the first questions was like, okay, where are we after these 2 years of Russian chairmanships, where we pretty much, I mean, there was a pause, there were some things happening in Russia. Very few people know really how things were progressing, where things are, and how to start moving work forward from there. There was nothing, literally nothing simple, nothing obvious, but the fact that it was from day one, the chairship focused so much on the working groups and thinking how to restart this engine of the council going. I think it was, as I'll come in a moment to this, it's really delivered its results. So a few months later, we had the decision, and it was once again, even though so many of those things have been completely invisible, there was so much effort, so many bilateral discussions going on how to make this happen, and eventually all 8 Arctic states decided to have the resumption of work through written means of procedure. And it was like the time when the statement came out, I think it is fair to say many of us were thinking, what does it even mean? Like, it was put in this language. They were thinking, like, how is this going to work in practice? But nonetheless, it was a small but important step moving forward. And yet, few months after that, we saw that so much work of the earth that it just creates incredible backlog, because it's only that much. If you have to comment on issues, if so many parties, stakeholders are involved in this, we all know how many emails kind of we receive per day, that it's kind of imagining that this work could continue only in this mode, in this modality, that was unsustainable. And that pushed further discussions and continued work, so that eventually what we saw last year was the resumption of virtual meetings of the working groups. As everyone knows, there are still no meetings at the political level, but working groups were able to resume their virtual meetings. And the reason why I find it so incredibly consequential and so important, and it's kind of this, I would say, well, the landmark of of Norwegian chairship. I think the best evidence of this, we had this morning where one of the very first sessions of this conference at 9, it was aimed at what Rolf was talking about. It was presentation of the climate update, and it was those were the key findings from the report, but it's so incredible to think that we haven't had those updates, that this work hasn't been released for done since 2021. And I think the best kind of point there had one of the speakers in that session, who is actually the vice chair of one of the working groups of the IPCC, when he underlined that for the IPCC, the work that they completed with the 6th assessment cycle, it was using the publications that were, or using the materials data that was published until 2021. And for them now to receive, as they are starting the next assessment cycle, to receive this update, which is really, I mean, I can only recommend for everyone to look at the findings that are now published, to kind of to say how important it is for the global body like the IPCC to have it. I think it speaks volumes to this. It's kind of how this really step-by-step approach of Norwegian chairship, how it has delivered, and I think the difference it can make. I know I went on for a long time on this one, but I could also mention 2 other things, because it's another thing that separately from focusing on the working groups that I think the chairship has been successful was actually working for chairship initiatives or events. And we had last year, there was large conference on ecosystem-based management. So many of you know here, extremely important and meaningful youth conference. So focusing consequently on the youth issues, on the youth perspectives, showing that even though it hasn't been so much the part of the Arctic Council agenda, even in this incredibly challenging and turbulent times, it is possible to push things forward. It is possible to put this new perspective on the agenda. And the last thing I'll say here, and it's last but not least, but also Norwegian chairship, recognizing its kind of limited space, still use the opportunity and put the cryosphere issues on the agenda of COP. Of the last COP in Baku. That was the initiative that came from the Arctic Council, and Norwegian chairship pursued it. So once again, bringing Arctic issues into global agenda, even those things are maybe not yet on the most stable ground, I would say those are things that are worth pointing out here.
That's a fantastic summary of the Norwegian chairship so far, and we still have 4 or 5 months to go. Perhaps we can get back to what's left in the Norwegian chairmanship a little bit later on in this discussion. But let's turn to Denmark now. Now, Christian, earlier in your career, you worked as an international negotiator in the Danish government. I know you don't have any particular insights into what's going on right now in Copenhagen, or maybe you do, actually, we can find out. But just in general, I mean, can you give us any insights on how a country like Denmark goes about preparing to take over as chair of an organization like the Arctic Council?
Yeah. As I'm a Dane myself, I have to correct you from the start to say that it's actually not it's not Denmark that is going to take over the chairmanship or to chairship or as member of the Arctic Council. It's the Kingdom of Denmark, consisting of Denmark and the Faroe Islands and Greenland. And actually now it has been decided that that Greenland will sit in the chair on behalf of the Kingdom of Denmark during the Kingdom chairship, actually. So, but coming back to your question, yes, I have some experience of working in the Danish government, and also with taking into account Greenlandic views and things like that. And I would say, and I haven't not so much with the Arctic Council, but I can think about how this was handled by the government in a way, and there is a big difference between now and just very short period before now. Because I think now it would be quite obvious for everybody that the only reason why the kingdom has a seat in the Arctic Council is because of the part of the kingdom that's part of the Arctic, which is Greenland. And everybody would think that it would be very natural that they had a key role as part of the kingdom here, especially also after the Danish Prime Minister has repeated again and again after President Trump's statements about taking over Greenland, that this is an issue for Greenland to decide under which country it should be and things like that. So everybody would think that they had a very natural and key role, and of course being the chair. But only not long ago, half a year or something like that was not the case. That was the old times in Denmark. And it was it was Denmark, it was Copenhagen who was in charge of issues related to the Arctic Council. Greenland was somehow taken care of in a way, and they have also experts sitting in working groups and so. But there was no doubt that that Denmark was in the lead, and the way the Arctic ambassadors were selected was the usual way in Danish diplomacy. There was a kind of around 1 year, and the ambassadors were distributed to Washington and Johannesburg, and so. And then there was an Arctic ambassador, a career diplomat was the chair, and that was supposed to be the case also. From the view of Copenhagen this time, until Greenland protested and said this is not, and at the same time promoted their own Arctic strategy with this very, very saying motto, nothing about us without us. That really became a strong feeling, and the self-confidence of Greenland grew very quickly, and they were not willing to accept this arrangements. And in saying that, as I said before, they were really in quite a strong position vis-à-vis Copenhagen, and now the turn. And that is coming back to what my own experience is also that we didn't think very much about Greenland in our way of conducting international affairs. We often forgot them, actually, even if when we made positions in international negotiations, we were actually also taking the position on behalf of Greenland and the Faroe Island. It was not bad will; it was just something that was far away in our minds and geographically. That's how it is. And there was an interview with the first Danish Arctic ambassador the other day in a daily newspaper. He actually admitted when he was picked in 2012, that Greenland was not consulted on that basis there.
Certainly a fast-moving situation. I mean, you actually wrote a report not that long ago, just a few months ago, for FNI on the upcoming Danish chairmanship. But I guess a lot of what you wrote then is maybe slightly outdated at this point, as the center of gravity for the next chair moves from Copenhagen to Nuuk. How do you think this will affect the Kingdom of Denmark's chair of the Arctic Council? Is there a certain uncertainty, or is there any sort of conflictual aspects? And is maybe the preparations for the chair fallen a bit behind because of this uncertainty as to who would actually be taking the lead in this situation?
I think there's no question about who will taking the lead. That would be Greenland, but there's also no question that it will be a joint effort in the Danish kingdom, and that Copenhagen will still have a lot of will still need to put a lot of resources in, as well as Faroe Islands. Actually, it's a joint effort. And then I think after hearing Gosia's situation, presenting how the situation is now and how Norway somehow have rescued it. But I think the situation is still very unclear and fragile. It's not, even if the Arctic Council is in function again, it's a kind of a shadow of itself compared to before. And I think, and I hope, and I think also that an overwhelming task will be to continue the work of Denmark to keep the Arctic Council alive and to keep the engine going, as Gosia said, with the scientific work and the working groups. I think it's a very unenviable task the Kingdom of Denmark has there, but I think that would be the thing. And then there are some issues, of course, with Greenland being in the chair that I think will affect it. And the more the Arctic Council is fragile because governments, it's not an exceptional case anymore. It's high politics, geopolitics have influence now. The more it's difficult for the governments, the Arctic governments, to work together. I think the more there will be focus on the people of the Arctic, and with a special situation with indigenous peoples with traditional lifestyles that are inhabiting the Arctic, and then thereby the work and the role of the permanent participants. Because in the worst case scenario, I think it would be necessary to establish more bottom-up work in the Arctic, and let this. That is the last resort, you could say, from the Arctic Council, is to give the role of the permanent participants. I would say. And then about the unenviable task, it's not being less or more enviable than the situation in the United States and the election of a new president. There's been so much talk about what's going on in the United States, so nobody has really had time to talk about how will that influence the Arctic Council. But I don't think the Arctic Council will go into easier times with President Trump. They are knowing how the former Trump administration, how they appeared in the Arctic Council last time they were there. It's speculation. We'll have to see.
Painting a much less optimistic picture than the previous experts in this panel. But Gosia, do you see things like as Christian's describing them as this ongoing crisis of the Arctic Council having no resolution in sight?
It's. I'm trying to bridge the more optimistic views from Jen and Rolf to our discussion. I do agree with all the points that Christian raised. I don't think it is really the crisis of the Arctic Council itself. I think we're just finding ourselves that, as we often say, that Arctic actually reflects wider developments. So that's our situation. We are just looking like in the lens, in the prism, in the Arctic Council. It is actually reflective of much bigger tensions and developments that are happening there. So it's kind of, so Arctic Council in this sense isn't exceptional forum. It is just reflecting this much bigger issues. I entirely agree that it's sort of, well, I described the effort and I think good results that came from Norwegian chairship. It feels fair to say that we might be looking at exponential growth of difficulties in the council with the new U.S. Administration. I mean, it's kind of, if we recall exactly the Rovaniemi ministerial meeting that I actually had, well, I want to say I had the pleasure to attend it. It was very interesting to attend that meeting in Rovaniemi. I mean, it was sort of at that time was unthinkable, like kind of the speech that was delivered by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when we went into this meeting. And now it's kind of, and now we are looking at sort of at the double difficulty of this, because at that point, the SAOs, the ambassadors, everyone was out in the room and they were discussing the document, like how to go about climate change and not mentioning it, and what do Nordic states feel about this, et cetera, et cetera. But at least you had everyone in the room, so to say. And it's kind of, and then we had incredible move on the parts of on the part of Finland that was able to save this meeting by having the declaration and so on. Or we didn't have the Rovaniemi declaration, we just had a statement, but the truth is because we had the report, we're able to save the council through this major crisis. I don't think until that time we really thought not speaking about the climate change will be a thing in the Arctic, and yet it was. But again, we had everyone in the room. And now we are looking at the prospect of a meeting in May. If everything we know about baby drill administration in the U.S., it's kind of it's going to be a wild guess of how references to climate change will be treated in the coming work, and yet we don't have discussion among 8 parties, at least as of today, openly about how to go about that. So yeah, there is definitely a bigger hurdle for us to cross. That being said, I still think that, I do think there are still good reasons on the sides for all 8 Arctic states to keep the Council alive, surviving and moving. Because one thing is about the Arctic Council, and it once again goes back to this point about working groups. I tend to think, well, engine is maybe more like a car thing, and now, they're all green, so maybe bicycle is actually a better thing to compare Council to. But the point is, the Council, in order to stay relevant, it needs to keep going. There is a minimum pace, but you need to have the Council going. And it's kind of the work of the working groups, of the expert groups, as exactly this thing. It can be moving slow, it can be moving fast, but it needs to keep on going, because otherwise my personal assessment would be we might have the Council out there, but it will just basically fall into oblivion. Whether the logo is there and so on, if this work is not there, then in some ways we lost the Council. The points, of course, that Christian made about the permanent participants, I'm 100% in agreement. So I could only reiterate those, and maybe just. Do you want to have another question, or I could still continue?
No, go on. I have more, but we're on a roll, so don't stop now.
Just 2 points. I mean, because the question about priorities of the Arctic Council, I would say personally I find this question a little secondary, because if we look at the programs of various chairmanships, in the past those were chairmanships, now those are chairships. If we're looking at the past programs, I mean, the formulations were different, but really we could boil them down really to 3 issues: environmental protection / climate change. Think about climate change, but environmental protection, people of the Arctic, and sustainable development, sometimes or oftentimes phrased as sustainable economic development. Everything else, kind of what the specific issue was on, was a little bit variation on this topic. So I think discussion about like what will be the priorities, probably it will stay in this realm. If there is Petteri Vuorimäki, the Finland senior Arctic official, ask a question of, what would be one piece of advice? And I think maybe what previous speakers alluded to, I would say exactly think hard and think creatively how to strengthen and resource working groups and permanent participants. And think about strengthening the secretariats, providing resources for indigenous peoples to engage in this work. I think if there is kind of the homework that we keep on doing, that Nordic states, in Canada, maybe US and Russia as well, can focus on moving forward, this would be really it. This is the time to, I think, focus on this, and I think the benefits from this we will see moving forward.
As you mentioned, Gosia, the managing the relationship with the United States will certainly be a challenge for the Kingdom of Denmark's chair coming up, but also managing relations with Russia is also going to be another thing that has to be done. On a recent episode of my podcast, I had Klaus Dodds on and talking about the chair of the Arctic Council, and he was very impressed by how Norway has managed relations with Russia the last couple of years, particularly because Norway has a border with Russia and it's used to dealing with Russia for many decades. Do you think Denmark, maybe Christian, you can weigh in on this? Do you think the Kingdom of Denmark will have a more difficult time managing this relationship with Russia than Norway, given Norway's long history of experience dealing with Russia?
Yeah. In any way, I think the chairship, the coming chairship, should really be in close contact with Norway and seek advice on how to conduct it, the chairship. I think that for many reasons, again, this is a personal experience because I moved to Norway. I know both countries quite well. I have witnessed that until recently, there's been there was much more political attention about Arctic issues in Norway than in Denmark, even if Greenland is part of the kingdom and is the world's largest island in the Arctic, and so there is a lot of I think there is a lot to learn and how to talk, and I'm sure that would be the case. On the relation to Russia, it may not be easier. It may be, I don't. Yes, Denmark is I think proportionally one of the countries that have provided most support for military aid to Ukraine in the war between Russia and Norway is. That's been criticized in Denmark, actually. I'm referring now to a debate in Denmark and Norway, whether Norway is providing enough for Ukraine. But in that case, you are asking about, it may not talk to the favor of Denmark in dealing with Russia, that they are actually providing so much funds for Ukraine. Yeah.
I think if I might just weigh on this one, yes, it is definitely how Norway managed and navigated this waters over the course of the last 2 years has been very constructive for Arctic collaboration. I'm thinking and I'm just and I'm allowing myself to share some thoughts as things have been getting more and more pace over the last 2 weeks. That I'm thinking that perhaps the move actually that it will be Greenland that will be in the chair seat for the upcoming chairship period might be a very good thing for many reasons, apart of course from Arctic issues and internal issues within the kingdom. By the fact that Greenland is not part of the EU, whereas Denmark is. And I think this is kind of looking at the one of the issues we touched upon before this discussion was that we are looking at now at the 6 years of Nordic chairships in the Arctic Council. Norway, Kingdom of Denmark going to Sweden. And it's kind of, and I liked before the idea that it's, that we could be looking at 6 years of trying to advance things on the agenda rather than looking only at two-year segments. And I still feel strongly about this idea. And Norway very early on with Kingdom of Denmark and with Sweden counterparts were in discussion exactly how to think about the transition and so on, how to make sure that things could be stretched beyond 2025. We've had this effort. That being said, it's we are now looking in the situation that it's also that Denmark is a part of the EU and Sweden is entirely part of the EU. So it's almost like as if we're going into the eye of the cyclone. Like, I hope it will be the calmest point and, in kind of in how the cyclone works. But if we're looking how these chairships are progressing, it's kind of, the leeway there to move between EU sanctions and the entire EU position versus Russia. Maybe we will be able to say like, hey, these are very different foreign affairs. This is the Arctic, this is European Union, but there is definitely the factor there. And because of this, maybe the fact that it will be Greenland that will be the main actor in this chairship, maybe it will give us even more space. And what Jen and Roel said, to focus really on Arctic issues, on things that are important for this region, rather than being just swept around in the whole geopolitical storm at this point.
I think Gosia made a very good point there. I agree with that. It's true. It's probably going in that way. It's going to be easier with Greenland in the forefront of the Arctic Council and not Denmark, I believe. This question about the Arctic Council chairship was very high on the agenda in Denmark or in the media. Then it was completely overshadowed about President Trump's statements about Greenland and so. But I can't help thinking about maybe also in that context the Greenlandic chair, the Greenland in the Arctic Council chair will have an effect to somehow somehow put some attention on Greenland, and it's not just any country that you can just as a big superpower take over. They're actually chairing the Arctic Council. You know, that could also be helpful in that way to have a Greenlandic Arctic chair.
Well, if one more point, and that's perhaps so going forward, if it's not a matter of a piece of advice, but I think there is also, if we're looking at the next 2 years, 4 years, there is also a question of for any upcoming chair to stay really agile, but also ready to act in this situation. And the reason why I'm saying is looking at the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council, where Iceland took over the chairmanship from Finland in Rovaniemi. In this meeting I mentioned, and of course most people in the room know how it went. I mean, there was a deep feeling that this is the lowest point for the Arctic Council, that it was just, the discussion was as, can this continue, and so on. We were looking into SAO report to make sure that work plans for the working groups are approved and so on. But there was a wide shared feeling this is the lowest point. And then we had the Trump administration, and it was it was Icelandic chairmanship, of course, and the meeting, the strategic meeting called by the Icelandic chairmanship in January 2020 here, right back to back with the Arctic Frontiers, happened to be the last in-person meeting of the council before COVID hit. So all of a sudden, all the issues of the world were on the desk of the Icelandic chairmanship. And yet what happened was in January 2021, change of US administration, everything that has been sort of put on the side because it had to be, Icelandic chairmanship pretty much from one day to next was ready to act and basically led to the adoption of the first ever strategic plan of the Arctic Council 5 months later. It was sort of, so it wasn't, I mean, the situation was as dire as possible for those 2 years. They were not meeting. It was extremely difficult situation. And yet when the administration changed, they were ready for it. They used this small window of opportunity, they went all in, and they adopted their strategic plan. And all of a sudden, 2 years later, in Reykjavik, we had a feeling that, okay, things maybe are picking up again. This is probably not, we'll be looking now into next 2 years because it will be right at the half of the term. But that being said, it's kind of like having also eyes perhaps on the price a little bit long term. So if the window of opportunity opens, yeah, maybe we'll be lucky and there will be some.
It's been quite a roller coaster the last few years in the Arctic Council. Which trajectory do you think we're going on now? Are we going more towards 2019 or more towards 2021 at this point?
Yeah, I am a bit pessimistic, as you already got the truth. But I agree very much that we should try to save what is already there. But I can't help thinking that it's a fragile construction because if Russia, for some reasons, decides to pull out, they haven't indicated that they would, but and also with the U.S. Unknown still how they would actually look at the Arctic Council, but not very proactively and positively in a way. I think it is, but it's difficult. I used to say, I'm not sure Gosia there agrees completely with me, but I used to say in the good old days, in the old times of the Arctic, that because the Arctic Council made all this scientific preparatory work on protecting the Arctic environment and protecting the Arctic seas, and so they should have the courage to take this step further that they never did before all this happened, to become a kind of a stronger institution, regional institution, being able to actually make to conduct environmental governance in a way and create an instrument for comprehensive protection of the Arctic Ocean to complement the fisheries agreement and things like that, thereby implementing global commitments. And so that's, I hope the Arctic Council will come there again, but we are far from that now. Now it's about saving what we have, and that is the work of the working groups and all the good science that is taking place there.
There is still some time left in the Norwegian chairmanship. We're talking about the Danish chair coming up very much, but there's still 4 or 5 months to go in the Norwegian chair. And as Christian's mentioned, Denmark has much to learn from this Norwegian experience of the past couple of years. And there was some hope that there could be this progression of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden with maybe some sort of Scandinavian stamp on the Arctic Council. But what remains in these next few months, and what can we expect? Maybe expect is hoping for too much, but what can we start thinking about in terms of the meeting, the actual meeting coming up in May that will hand over from Norway to Denmark?
Yeah, actually I don't know much. I would have hoped maybe I may have missed something, but I haven't seen the final Danish kingdom strategy for the Arctic and the Arctic Council. I haven't seen the appointment of an Arctic ambassador either. Things are getting close now to the presidency starting. I think it should be about time now to have that, and to then be able to prepare to really use the last month to prepare very thoroughly for the Arctic Council takeover of the chairship. I think it's about time now that this happens. But I haven't heard that it has been when it will come, and actually what will be in it, except that the Greenland made an Arctic strategy as a forerunner for the kingdom strategy, and since Greenland has this role and has this self-understanding of its role, I think the Greenlandic strategy will very much be the basis of the overall strategy.
As Gosia, as you mentioned earlier, these priorities for Arctic Council chair periods are often pretty similar. There's variations, but there are usually these 3 main points. Is there any idea of what the Kingdom of Denmark might put forward as part of their agenda at this point? I guess that's still yet to be seen. Is that announced at the meeting, or when does that start to take shape?
I could think that if I should guess on something, I would think that since Greenland is a country with a minority of an indigenous group, Inuits, I think they would have quite a lot of emphasis on the work the permanent work of the permanent participants and the collaboration between indigenous peoples across the Arctic borders. I'm quite sure that it's always high on the agenda, but even from a Greenlandic side, it will have probably even higher priority than former chairships.
Yeah, I think I would maybe echo along the same lines. I think it's, if anything, putting in the front and center of the next chairship period people of the Arctic, well-being of people of the Arctic. We could imagine issues further elevating issues as mental health, so many issues that communities in the Arctic are facing. And it's kind of not only, it makes perfect sense, this is really what so much of this collaboration is about. Maybe these are actually also issues where the consensus, or at least tacit agreement among all 8 Arctic states states could be easier reached. Directly to your question, normally the program is developed over several months before. So I guess if we haven't seen it, it's because there are just so many other things happening. And I would imagine it's also a question because the Arctic Council still operates through bilateral discussions. It's kind of, instead of one meeting that used to take place in the past, now the chairship needs to have almost separate meetings with most countries. I mean, not literally individually, but almost to the point. So of course, those things takes place so much longer. If I can throw it just one more point. I mean, one other thing is that I honestly, when we were preparing for the discussions, I was thinking it might be the first Arctic conference, but things feel so that I had a feeling I had to check international news this morning before coming to the conference.
Yes.
You know, to make sure you don't shoot me with a question because I just missed the headline on, you know, New York Times or so. So definitely there is something to be said about fast pace, and it's exactly, well, the media outlets that we never thought could be having so much interest in Arctic issues. But it's just one observation of how incredibly difficult it is from this place today to say how things will look like in 5 months. Because it's the question of, on the one hand, U.S. Arctic policy, even for previous Trump administration, it has been actually a very stable one. There hasn't been any major changes. If we look at the main documents, they have been very stable and building from one to another. I'm not sure that we would make a safe bet that this will be the situation at this point. So it's just so hard to say. But I wanted to raise one other point because it will be squarely in the hand of the chairship, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark's chairship, and this is the science agreement. So the agreement on enhancing Arctic international scientific cooperation and in the Arctic that was negotiated under the auspices, etc., etc. The point is, one of 3 legally binding agreements negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, and it is fair to say that the one that has been mostly dead letter up to this point, and it's kind of that never really took off. But the reason why I'm mentioning is because what was decided for Icelandic chairmanship at that time was it will be the chair of the Arctic Council that will have the responsibility, possibility to move work on this agreement further. Because in contrast to the agreements on the oil spill and on search and rescue, which have been very squarely housed in the working groups of the Arctic Council, in the EPPR, and we've all seen incredible push that this agreement provided to the EPPR, and science agreements sort of stayed without the institutional home. And it was sort of, and I don't know how many times we had discussions like, do you know what's happening with this agreement? And, you know, everyone just looking at one another and trying to find source of information like, how is this agreement advancing? We all agree this is so important that we facilitate the scientific collaboration in the Arctic. There we have the instrument and no place to find information about this. But I'm raising this point that maybe it's also one of the issues that is squarely in the hand of the chair to try to look into how this agreement could look forward. Am I very optimistic on that? I will not say, but the tool is there, and I think we are in the position to try to use everything that we have in our hands.
Well, it's a message to the upcoming chair, perhaps, from Gosia here.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for more. So thank you both very much. And let's maybe very briefly, we actually ran a little longer than expected, perhaps time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if anybody has anything they'd like to ask Christian or Gosia. Okay.
I was just going to ask, what's the cause, what's at the root of the failure to launch that agreement on scientific cooperation? What is it about that pillar that made it difficult to implement?
I guess that's, this could be a longer discussion, I can just offer my personal observation to that. It's one of the things is that even though the agreement was negotiated with the significant input from scientists, what eventually happened was that science agreement was signed by ministers of foreign affairs, which is the furthest ministry from implementing this agreement as one could think of. Because the issues that were actually Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit saying that this is the furthest ministry, but the point is that issues related to scientific collaboration or, for example, facilitating the crossing of samples across borders and so on, this is really not in hands of these ministries, and other ministries haven't been really involved in negotiating this agreement or having their say in how this is going to move forward in practice. Yes, there were negotiations, but it's kind of, if we just see kind of where the agreement was negotiated, was put kind of where from it arose, it really felt it is missing the institutional rooting in the countries, in 8 Arctic states themselves. That being said, it's kind of, it's not a walk that cannot, it's not the distance that cannot be bridged or walked, but it's definitely something that in hindsight probably could have been better developed in the course of negotiations, in the course of preparing the agreement, rather than just saying this will be the contact points and we'll take it from there.
Okay, and one last question.
Yeah, for Christian. So you articulately wandered from the structure of the Arctic Council to the working groups, and then very quickly conflated that with Norwegian support to the war in Ukraine and Danish support to the war in Ukraine, and how those external political decisions influence the Arctic Council structure.
I'm not sure. That was what I've been saying here was probably the thing that I was that was very much speculation from my side, since we are of course no. It was just that there was a question of whether the Kingdom of Denmark was in a better or worse situation to sort things out with Russia or not, and I really don't. My answer is I really don't know. But then I just mentioned that was the speculation that since Denmark is providing much more support for Ukraine than Norway is, then that could be a problem. But then I very much agree with what was said by Gosia, that the fact that Greenland will now be in the chair could change that situation to the better.
Yeah, my question is this: how does the Arctic Council and those of us who care deeply about the Arctic further insulate Council and the 3 areas, the environmental protection, sustainable development, and the support to indigenous populations? How do we insulate that from the very things that you brought up? Are there proven techniques to try to keep those things separate? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, we were always so proud in the Arctic Council context that we were keeping these things separate, because we also had our geopolitical discussions before, and then we always said this is exceptional, we can keep it away. We are not so good at it anymore, but I think I would let Gosia come up with whether you have any ideas. But well, then Norway managed to balance on this very, very thin line, and that's and I agree so much that it was remarkable, and it was so well diplomatic work that that need to be continued, and I hope it will be possible also when Norway is no longer in the chair.
These episodes will be, or these sessions will be part of the podcast, so you can actually go back and listen and see if these speculations that Christian and Gosia have put out there were correct a year from now or not. And I guess if you want to just go back and listen to some of these great insights they both had for all of these sessions today. And we'll take a bit of a break now, 10, 15 minutes, and come back with the third part of this 3-part session on the future of the Arctic Council. So thank you all very much for joining, and thank you very much, Christian and Gosia, for joining us here.
Thank you.